Bet the Board.
What do you mean you don't bet? I mean, I don't bet. You know, I don't gamble. I never have, and I never will. Yeah, right. I'll bet you $20 I can get you gambling before the end of the day.
You owe me 15 grand, pal.
Pay him. Pay that man his money.
It's the Bet the Board podcast.
God likes me. He really, really likes me.
In the end, I wound up right back where I started. I could still pick winners, and I could still make money for all kinds of people back home. And why mess up a good thing?
Here's Payne Insider and Todd Fuhrman.
Welcome into the Bet the Board podcast, college football edition, the penultimate episode of the 2023 season, with the college football playoff lurking on the horizon on January 1st. Hopefully all you and yours had a tremendous holiday season thus far. I'm your host, Todd Fuhrman, joined as always by my esteemed colleagues and co-hosts on this fine program, Payne Insider and Brad Powers. Gentlemen, hopefully the Christmas holiday didn't add any unnecessary stress into the day-to-day, and bowl season has been going swimmingly for the both of you.
I wouldn't call it swimmingly, but we're going to continue to grind this last week away and see if we can try to turn a profit here.
We've added some weight. That's it.
Well,
Christmas season is here. Cookies, you name it. Everything's in play.
I guess
liquor.
That's what I was going to say, Payne. You know, the question a lot of our listeners have. I mean, how many White Russians did you consume at the Payne family Christmas?
Well, prior to that, had a nice little dinner Thursday after I believe we shot an NFL podcast.
All the days
Thursday,
blend
so
together.
I had a big dinner there. It was loaded with some White Russian, so we kind of kicked off the holiday on the right note.
All right, that's all that matters. You have to keep perspective of the eye on the prize, but also have to enjoy quality time with the family, especially this time of year. But a lot of ground for us to cover, gentlemen. I mentioned the two big college football playoff games. I know a lot of our listeners hoping we'll get into all the New Year's Six, and quite frankly, so much of this stuff has moved already. Will continue to move as we monitor player availability. It has really been a moving target in the current college football landscape, and I think that probably gives us a perfect place to start before we actually get into the games themselves. When we look at the overall state of college football, we've seen a lot of the big name quarterbacks find landing spots. We've seen some players rumored to be ending up at a program that haven't made decisions, whether it's Cam Ward, whether it's DJU, whether it's Will Howard, who everyone thought was a formality to USC and now suddenly having flirtations with Ohio State. Brad, when you look at the way college football is going, I mean, we talked a little bit about it in the wake of the college football playoff announcement and how they shafted Florida State and some of the challenges that the sport has in general. You know, what is some of your overall takeaways as we've seen some of these familiar names find new landing spots, but still that level of uncertainty, whether it's to handicapping bowl games or just looking at the college football big picture overall?
I'll start big picture and then work down to what it means for, handicapping and betting purposes. I'll say this as far as big picture. I mean, not to be a Grinch during Christmas, but I tend to think the sport's going in a negative direction. And I'm not blaming I want to get it straight. I'm not blaming the players or anything. It has nothing to do with them. I'm glad that they're finally getting paid for what they do. It's just a lack of leadership at top of college football in general. That allowed a very, a storied conference, Pac-12, go by the wayside. Nobody really cares. But what they do care about, obviously, is TV contracts. And I don't know how that's going to go over with the sport. And look, everyone's excited about the 12-team playoff next year. I get it. Something new to get excited about. But I got to tell you, as a guy that's been a fan of college football first and foremost before I even considered betting it, a lot that drew a lot of people to college football was a sense of urgency. Every game mattering, and you're going to lose that a little bit with a 12-team playoff, and I just wonder if that's going to hurt the sport. Maybe not next year, but down the road. Now, obviously, a lot of movement, to say the least. Coaches, players, transfer portal, your recruiting, National Signing Day, contracts, NIL, and whatnot. Just so much more uncertainty than we've ever seen in the sport, and it's very tough pricing this stuff. And if you don't believe me, I mean, let's just look at these bowl games so far. If you had a crystal ball and said, you know what, there's so much uncertainty, I don't know if I can bet these bowl games. I am just going to bet the biggest moves. I have the crystal ball in front of me. I'm going to bet the 16 biggest moves so far. Anything that moves 3 or more points, I'm going to bet it because somebody has to know something if it's moving 3 or more points. you'd be 5-11. So far, I don't know. I mean, how does that stack up? I mean, I've been following it for 4 years as far as tracking those moves. 2,000 game sample size. If you have that crystal ball, you're 60%. Huge sample size. So I know it's a small sample, but I mean, I don't know that anybody really can price a lot of this stuff until we get a couple of years of a sample size here. But so much uncertainty, and I know I'm getting to that middle age, and maybe I'm just being a Scrooge, but I don't like it. I'll just put it that way.
Look, I don't think you are, Brad. I mean, you mentioned the bowl games and some of the movement, and had a chance to talk to a number of folks that have asked me, how you go about handicapping bowl season, and they do more of it at a rudimentary level than anything else. And I described it to the NFL preseason, but having watched the first 10 days or so of bowls, I'm not sure that's even fair, because at least in the NFL preseason, we know who the players are. We've seen them play at college. You have a track record of what they've done during preseason games. Some of these games, you have no idea who these players are, where their focus is. Even the kids that are out there fighting for jobs, it is the definition of uneven. And you mentioned some of the biggest moves. I mean, hell, we had one last night as we record here on a Wednesday morning between UNLV and Kansas, a game 13 down to 7.5, betting that thing like they had today's newspaper a day early to try and take advantage. Now, granted, the game could have fallen in the middle. We've seen a lot of double-digit comebacks, but there's no doubt. We talk about variance all the time. Bowl season has been the perfect encapsulation of that with some of this player movement. And Payne, I mean, when we talk player movement, obviously one program amongst others has been hit pretty hard, and we know the dominoes have started falling with Florida State. We've seen a lot of the opt-outs for their bowl game. I think the big surprise that came out, Tate Rodemaker taking his talents elsewhere. You have to imagine that Florida State thought he was going to be the guy under center for Georgia, and the betting market responding. But for being a college football fan, being close to one program and everything you've seen to try and tie it together with gambling, what's kind of your general takeaway given everything that's unfolded over the last couple weeks?
I think Brad hit everything perfectly. You mentioned FSU, and we do like to talk about things that we know best, and we can use some of those specific instances and understand that they're likely happening at a lot of the major programs. This is a lot to do with the snub. I mean, you think about the calendar right now. That's one thing college football's got to change.
Great point.
Because these coaches right now are being killed. We watched ESPN put their camera on Florida State as the selection committee was making their decision, and you watch a dejected Jordan Travis and Mike Norvell, and within about 15 minutes, Norvell's got to fire the troops back up. Within 4 hours, he's doing 2 in-home visits. It's just ridiculous. And so now all of a sudden you have these kids back home, all the coaches are on the road, and you see what's unfolded here in the last 3-4 weeks. I don't know if I can remember a season where any team has been as successful going 13-0, winning their conference championship game, and it just doesn't feel like that right now. We knew a lot of guys would be moving on to the NFL, but I think this is just the day and age where coaches are on the road recruiting and people are trying to pluck off your players. College football is in a weird spot right now because it's the Wild West. And I don't know if it can survive in its current state. There's got to be some changes. You're seeing what certain teams are doing, and it's just a different vibe throughout. Like, no doubt, right? Alabama, Georgia, Ohio State are spending. That's obvious. But their pedigree, their recent history of success and development allows them not to overspend. Then the overspenders right now are pretty clear and obvious, right? I mean, Miami, Ole Miss, Auburn, and it's working right now. I think where you started the conversation with some of the quarterback movement. A couple of the guys that knew they weren't going to have as robust of a market found their spot. But now you have a Will Howard situation. You have this Cam Ward situation playing out. And DJU, he's kind of that third guy. He's going to end up probably where one of those two guys don't. It's just interesting times, right? The biggest and the best, the 1% is making the vast majority of the money. And they should, to Brad's point. The lower class, so to speak, is transferring for an opportunity to just play or go to a better school for education once they realize football isn't going to pay them professionally. But there is a ton of bad advice on the other side of this coin. Yep. Right? It's great that the players are being paid. but there's just so much bad advice being flung around because there aren't any public contracts. That's the other difference to the NFL.
Yeah, no level of
Right?
transparency.
Yeah, there isn't any. So agents are leaking fabricated numbers. Players are gossiping about what so-and-so is making. And so a player enters the market thinking it's extremely robust without truly knowing their value. And for the vast majority of the players, if not more, the number is far less. The money isn't being paid timely or at a rate of expectation, right? The vast majority of these players exiting are also doing so in an unprofessional manner, so they're not welcome back if they tip their toes into the portal and realize, holy shit, my market isn't booming, right? So you have a guy, and I'll specifically name them because, again, I'm close to the program. Brad watched the spring game for Florida State. There was two guys that were like king of the spring. It was Kentron Portier and Rodney Hill. Rodney Hill was a guy who wanted to be paid close to Trey Benson status. He just committed to FAMU, right? So it's like... And you just saw DJ Lundy, a guy who was going to be a rotational piece, who came in as a 3-star kid, got fully developed, and he probably wasn't going to be on the field as a 3-down linebacker again because he's a little bit troubling in coverage. And so he goes and tests the market. All this talk about USC, Miami. He ends up at Colorado. And this is a kid who had close ties to a Derek McClendon, who left for Colorado last year, didn't get as many snaps as he would at Florida State, received about 35% of the money he was told he was going to get through NIL. Most of that was spent on jewelry that got robbed at the UCLA game. So, like, there's conversations where, like, I know Derek McClendon spoke to the coaching staff and said, this is the biggest regret of my life. And then you have another Florida State player going there and doing it because the market wasn't as robust. He didn't leave in a professional manner because only some of these guys have proper agent representation. Some of it's a handler from back home. It's Uncle Fred who's giving them advice, right? It just, these kids are getting terrible advice. But I think kind of wrapping this up and taking it back to where, Brad put us, it's like, I truly don't know if this model is sustainable, right? Like, college football is great. The fans are more passionate than the NFL because many have attended that school. It's the school that's local to them. But we know the NFL product is far superior. Might not be this year because of all the quarterback play, but right, like, guys are simply bigger, stronger, faster, more athletic. If college turns into a pro game and the product isn't as good, college football's lost a great portion of what made it so great. So it's really weird times out there. There's also like this other level of player that is changing the entire landscape of college football, right? It's the player that's good. They've developed into like this quality rotational piece. And you see certain positions every offseason that are going to be a little bit more barren than the other with talent. So if you look this year, it's linebacker. There's not a lot of good guys in the portal. Everyone needs one. They're a little bit more valuable at the college level than in the NFL. All of a sudden, if you're a good player, your prime earning years are likely now because you don't have an NFL guy. And so it's not the 5-star kid, it's not the quarterback, it's the 3-star try-hard that the staff has spent multiple years developing that's now hitting the portable for what might be his largest paycheck playing the sport. So you now have like that tier of player too that's changing college football. It's tough to unpack. There's so many moving pieces, and I think the calendar needs to get adjusted pretty quickly. And I think if it does, then what was a prime earning season for us, bowl season, might be a little bit easier to project.
Brad, with all this player movement, do you think teams can be successful doing this, kind of approaching the, hey, look, we're going to go out and not say vigilante justice, but we're going to buy players, plug them in, and hope it all works out? We had an example yesterday of Texas State with G.J. Kinney. He brings in 50 transfers, but a lot of those players were his when he was at Incarnate Word, knew they could fit the system, and it paid dividends, getting them their first bowl victory down to San Marcos. On the other side, look, to Payne's point, Ole Miss spending a ton of money. They're getting the big names, but you wonder if these teams face any level of adversity in the first 3 or 4 games with some of these grueling conference schedules, how quickly some of this stuff can turn.
I have my doubts on the teams that are relying exclusively on the portal. I say that, and obviously Florida State, hit hit some home runs in the portal the last couple of years. But it's not like they were overly relying on it. They were filling some needs, and they've already developing guys. And, I ask myself this, well, what are the top of the sport doing? What is Nick Saban, Ryan Day, Kirby Smart, Harbaugh, and all those guys doing? Well, they're still signing 20-plus high school kids. They're still going out there and getting and recruiting. That's still the lifeblood of the program. So I don't see those schools overly relying on the transfer portal. I think the key to success would be in any particular year, you get 6 to 10 guys in the portal to fill some needs. Most of those guys starters, or at the very least on the 2 deep at key positions, and then you just go out and recruit. I would think outside of the Alabamas, the Ohio States of the world, I'm telling you, if I was a coach outside of that top very 1% of the sport, I wouldn't necessarily be going out and buying the 5-star kid. I would much rather go for a higher character 4-star kid that's maybe not a top 50 player, but he's a top 200, top 150 player that understands about getting developed at the program. He's not necessarily a big of a transfer portal risk. He's not thinking money first. I think you can have a lot of success with those types of guys, and at least I would be more focused on retainment and keeping your roster together and keeping your culture together than having an entirely different roster each year. I really question the teams that are going to rely overly on the portal.
Very curious to see what some of these scouting and analytics departments look like on college campuses to make sure that they're identifying the right pieces from a talent standpoint and cultural fit. But Payne, I cut you off, so go ahead, jump in.
Yeah, the market has changed so much. And again, Brad referenced Florida State. They hired a GM, Derek Ray, 3 years ago, somewhere in that window. But Florida State was ahead of this market. And now I don't know if they are. People have caught up. But I think it's just going to lead to different kinds of business. I mean, initially Florida State was all about retention. They were going to develop. They needed to go that route because they weren't getting the high school talent needed to compete at a certain level because of what was going on previously, right? With how Jimbo left things, with how Willie was. So you needed the on-field result to turn into high school recruiting. I believe Florida State thought the 13-0 was going to help them, and yes, they're going to finish with a top 10 class, but it was number 3 going into early signing day. I shouldn't say always, but I've asked you guys this question a long time, and Brad kind of hit on it. Like, if you are a top 50 player, I would much rather go to the place that is going to develop me and make sure I become a first-round pick in the NFL rather than taking a few extra $100,000 pre-tax now. And I know that's difficult, and I'm probably saying it in a different position than a lot of these players and their families. But I've never understood that, right? We had, Jeremiah Smith, the number 1 wide receiver in the entire country. And yes, he should try to get as much money as possible within reason. He's a silent commit. Even though he's committed to Ohio State, he was a silent commit to Florida State after the Miami game. He had his championship game that was in Tallahassee. He's wearing Florida State gloves, Florida State hat. They had to remove a video online because someone interviewed him. He slipped up and said he was committed to Florida State. That's how committed he was to Florida State. And you have a program like Ohio State who, loses a defensive lineman, and Scott loses a running back, loses a wide receiver, and all of a sudden this new NIL money frees up, and they have to go in because you've lost 3 straight to Michigan, and Ryan Day feels like he's on the hot seat a little bit. Perceptually, the one position that they have owned in college football is the wide receiver position. So now you go and lose the number 1 wide receiver. They had to reset the market. And
if you're going to pay Marvin Harrison $25 million to keep him around, Payne, I mean, what's a drop in the bucket for a guy like Jeremiah Smith?
But here's my point, going back to the top. Who now all of a sudden is back in the mix for Ohio State? It's Will Howard. They didn't have a quarterback. So some of that NIL money gets freed up on the high school level because, you couldn't close some guys, and now Will Howard's back in the market. And so it's just it's created a lot of uncertainty. We had kept hearing, right, leading up to this game here, is that they loved Brown. He was showing some things. would make me a little nervous because I was looking at Ohio State, and all of a sudden you're kicking the tires on Will Howard. Like, is Brown as good as you've been kind of lauding him in the last 3 or 4 weeks, right? All this improvement that he's made, it's like, oh, now we're back in the market for Will Howard. So it's just, there's so many moving parts. And typically in markets, like, you want that as someone who's sophisticated because you think more turmoil is going to be better for you as a sophisticated investor. Man, it's been tough. We've had to pick our spots. Like, the volume is down. Now, the spots we've picked so far, knock on wood, have been great. But to Brad's point, like, he's more of the volume guy. And it kind of he's made it sound like it hasn't been the most prosperous bowl season. And so, just thinking from his perspective, like maybe, less going early is crazy. That's not, even though you're crushing the market. And that's what you've been taught. But it's starting to feel like bowl season might be more pick your spots than, just firing because that's what's ingrained in you because of what's going on in college football right now.
Yeah, I mean, look, and I can't speak to, some of the philosophies out there. To your point, Brad, we know volume has kind of been the name of the game. I mean, you're grabbing the best of the number. You have opportunities closer to kickoff to keep the position, figure out to come over the top. But to Payne's point, I mean, I think Payne, to this point, I have 2 full positions that I've bet in bowls so far, maybe. To this point in the bowl season, which is normally one of the more profitable times of year as a sports bettor. So everything is fluid. We'll see exactly how all the player moves sort themselves out. And maybe more importantly, when some of these college football win totals for 2024 get hung. Although I'm not convinced necessarily these kids enrolling in the spring are still going to be there by the time football starts in the fall with the calendars you guys mentioned and some of the movement if those NIL payments don't arrive on time. But fascinating times and maybe not the best direction of the sport. We'll see if this stuff does indeed get itself sorted out and what the landscape looks like with some of these power conferences that are there, the 12-team playoff, and a number of different things going forward. My final thing to kind of put a bow on this was Chip Kelly had probably some of the most prescient comments out of anybody talking about how college football at this point needs to operate independently from the rest of NCAA athletics. The idea that some of these rivalries can still be preserved, you can still build conferences and allow familiar foes to play each other on an annual basis should not be inextricably tied to the other sports that are out there, whether it's even college basketball, the Olympic sports, and some of the other non-revenue things that are out there. So Brad comes full circle. You get a commissioner for college football. You figure out what's best for the 65 to 70 Division I programs. Everybody else starts playing in a second tier, whether it's FCS, if it's FBS Division II, however they decide to structure it. Have to imagine there'll be a lot of moving pieces as we begin to go forward. But we do have 4 blue bloods, or at least 3 blue bloods, and a team that makes its second college football playoff appearance in the Washington Huskies to get to for the games on New Year's Day. But before we do that, I want to encourage all of you, our Bet the Board listeners, to be able to follow Brad on social media at BradPower7. You can follow Payne there as well, and you can follow me at Todd Fuhrman. So, gentlemen, we look at Alabama, Michigan in the granddaddy of them all, and we look at the numbers on this game. Alabama finds themselves in unusual territory, a slight underdog against Michigan. Alabama hasn't been a dog against anybody not named Georgia going all the way back to 2009. Total in the game, 45. But, Brad, even before we get into some of the X's and O's here, just to kind of paint a picture for where these two teams are in 2023 versus where they were last year, what's Alabama's power rating done from where they closed last season, and the same for the Maize and Blue?
Alabama's down a couple points since the end of last season. No surprise there, considering the struggles that Alabama had at least at the start of the season. Michigan's up about a point, even though, and we'll get into it, I'm not sure we really know exactly how good this Michigan team is just due to a relatively weak strength of schedule, but Michigan's slightly up from last season.
And these teams, no strangers to one another. There were some war words about satellite camps between Nick Saban and Coach Harbaugh, a little bit of verbal sparring. These teams played a bowl game against one another back in 2020, a game Michigan had a lead at the half, and I'm sure most Michigan fans had hoped that game stopped at the half as Alabama ran out in the second half, including a late touchdown when Nick Saban and company could have taken knees. So it adds a little bit of fuel to the fire. When we look at the SEC overall in the college football playoff, they're 10-1 in semifinal games, now having won 10 straight. When we look at some of the trends, limited sample size, so all of you folks out there that want extended sample sizes, pump the brakes before you come at us with vitriol. Under is hitting 6 straight playoff semifinal games. Actually, that's not right, so I'll throw that out. Michigan, TCU. So my research is already out the window as we get going. But Alabama 6-2 straight up the last 8 games as an underdog. Michigan in their bowl games, not exactly great by any stretch of the imagination, going 0-6 straight up NATS. Coach Harbaugh has really struggled in that department. Alabama can become one of the first teams to win back-to-back games versus an AP or college football playoff #1 team within a single season, having accomplished the feat against Georgia in the SEC title game. They would join a team in the Miami Hurricanes who were able to do so previously. When we look at Michigan, they're seeking their first national championship since 1997, one that they split with Nebraska. Can be the first Big Ten team to win the national title since Ohio State did it back in 2014. Michigan becomes the first Big Ten team to make the college football playoff in 3 straight seasons, despite not having won a college football playoff semifinal game just yet. And I think what was interesting, guys, is Blake Corum talked about Coach Harbaugh mixing up the practice plans, saying we practice really hard and we'll have a walkthrough, still full speed, just not hitting. Execution is top-notch, still precise, saying that the team may have come in a little bit tired and fatigued in their previous installments. Brad, when we look at Alabama offensively matched up against the Michigan defense, at least on paper, Michigan checks all those boxes, but it's nice luxury to have in college football when you play 8 glorified exhibition games and only 4 regular season football games before you get going. They're going to face an athlete in quarterback Jalen Milroe that you don't see week in, week out in the Big Ten by any stretch. Now, we've talked at great lengths about the Alabama offensive line having question marks, the Alabama skill position players not cut from the same cloth as that offense that Michigan faced in a bowl game back in 2020. But when you look at this side of the ball, do you see a clearly defined edge for either of these teams, or is it as much about Alabama and how they're going to attack a Michigan defense that looks good on the surface but may have some underlying concerns?
I mean, basic counting stats, analytics are going to say advantage Michigan here. I mean, when you consider the fact Michigan's defense, #1 in the country in points per game allowed, #2 in yards per game, #4 in yards per play, #3 in EPA per pass, #9 in early downs EPA, #7 in defensive EPA. Meanwhile, Alabama, I mean, you're looking at a team that can't crack the top 25 in yards per play, can't crack the top 50 in yards per game on the season, scoring up specifically over the last 5 games of the season to crack the top 20 there. But, the advanced analytics, I mean, not in the top 20 in EPA per pass, not in the top 40 in EPA per rush. They don't have much success in early downs EPA. So, I mean, obviously this Alabama offense, a far cry from the teams that had, Jalen Hurts and Tua at quarterback just a few years ago. Certainly, you mentioned it, they don't have the level of skill talent at running back and wide receiver anywhere near what they had in those seasons. With that being said, the trend line is much better for them, at least down the stretch, specifically after the bye week. And that started with the LSU game. I mean, this Alabama offense, if you're going to have a subset, last 5 games was their best 5 games. 42 points per game, up more than 10 points per game from what they averaged the first 8. 456 yards per game the last 5. That's up nearly 100 yards per game what they averaged at the start of the season. They've been able to run the football a little bit better. They've been able to protect Jalen Milroe a little bit better. I will say Georgia did sack Milroe 4 times, so that's still going to be a significant worry. The Alabama offensive line has been a weakness all year, allowed 43 sacks. That's 118th in the country in sacks allowed per game, 95th in PFF's pass blocking efficiency. So that's a major concern going up against a very talented and very deep Michigan defensive front. But I think the X factor, no, we're not going to be breaking news here, is obviously Jalen Milroe. And when he started to perform better is when they actually allowed him to start running more. If you look at starting with that LSU game, 20-plus attempts. They hadn't had him run that much throughout the course of the season. Makes some sense. You don't want to, beat him up and get him banged up. You already saw what you had at backup in the South Florida game. You don't have backup quarterbacks. You can't get Milroe hurt or it's going to be a disastrous season. So I like some of the adjustments that Alabama did down the stretch, running Milroe more. Obviously, he's been very good with the deep ball all season long, one of the best in the entire country. But the worry would be up front for Alabama. Not necessarily. I mean, they got a couple of good guys, Booker and Lathan. But, man, rewatching some of their games, the true freshman, I know he's going to be good, in future years. But Caden Proctor, I mean, that's a weakness there that Michigan can take advantage of. Another guy that showed up and not in a good way, the center, Seth McLaughlin. Major issues with snaps in multitude of games, including the SEC championship game. That's got to get corrected. The thing that I'm not so definitive here on whether or not either team has an edge is, man, I know Michigan's defense has everything you want as far as the counting stats, but who in the hell have they played offensively this year? I mean, the only
How dare you talk poorly, Brad, about your beloved alma mater and our local team, the UNLV Running Rebs?
Yeah, I mean, one top 40 offense this year in yards per game and yards per play. That was Ohio State, just so happened to be the team that they allowed the most yards against, 378, 150 more on average in the other 12 games. You mentioned it. Michigan has not seen a quarterback of this athletic ability. The only guy that came close to having a guy with a running threat was Nebraska's quarterback, Harburg, who obviously far cry talent-wise. But that just so happened to be the other game. Michigan's defense allowed more than 300 yards this year. The only other game was when they faced a mobile quarterback in that one. So I have some concerns. Michigan, you mentioned it, very good tackling team, but in some of these bowl games they've gotten sloppy, especially against TCU last year. They were sloppy, so hopefully the practice schedule helps them out in that regard. I'm anxious to see what Michigan does because Georgia specifically in the SEC championship game, not one but two spies on Milroe. And Milroe, I know Alabama won the game outright as an underdog, but when you look at his offensive grade per PFF, it was his season low, especially in the passing grade. So I'm anxious to see if Michigan kind of copies that formula that Georgia used. But I guess, a whole lot of me talking there for several minutes. I don't see a clear-cut edge here. It really comes down to if Milroe protects the football and and if Alabama can somewhat limit that Michigan pass rush, that'll go a long way in determining the outcome of the game. I think that the other side of the ball, I think, will be a bigger story.
It's such a fascinating matchup because normally when you have 13 data points for a couple of these teams, you should have a better indication of exactly how they're going to perform when they step up in class. But there are so many unknowns for this Alabama offense, even as well as they've made strides over the latter portion of the season that you highlighted, Brad, in a Michigan defense that just isn't used to seeing this caliber of athlete in terms of operating under center like they will in Jalen Milroe in a game of this magnitude. Now, Payne, on the other side, this Michigan offense, 27 points per game differential this season, the most by an FBS team since Georgia did it in 2021. You look at what they've done offensively, 30-plus points in 11 to 13 games. They've done an outstanding job protecting the football, second best turnover differential in the country. But when they played that upper echelon that we mentioned on the defensive side, Michigan's offense really struggled. And I know a lot of Wolverines fans and some of their beat writers will say, well, part of it's because J.J. McCarthy wasn't at 100%. They couldn't showcase the full offense. But whether J.J. McCarthy's healthy or not, that offensive line was a legitimate concern in the Big Ten championship. Every time they were forced into pass protection, Iowa pinned their ears back and made life miserable. Michigan's offense lacks some of that burst. Blake Corum has put up gaudy touchdown numbers. We know where he got voted in the Heisman, but looks a far cry from the running back and the offensive line he was running behind last year. Receivers, take your pick if you actually truly love one of them. But in steps an Alabama defense that people want to say was great against Georgia. I think the three of us, and not to put words in either of your mouths, believe that Georgia handcuffed themselves in the SEC title more than Alabama making strides. And it was only a week before that Auburn ran right, ran left, and ran right down the middle against this Alabama defensive front. So I ask you the question, do you see a path for either one of these units having a commanding advantage over their counterpart?
You said everything. That was nicely summed up there. And going back to the very top, the question you proposed to Brad about power ratings, I think that's what makes this game difficult and adds layers of variance you wouldn't initially expect with two blue buds like this. Alabama's talent level is down relative to past versions. Power ratings wise, this version of Michigan is multiple points worse than the team that entered last year's college football playoff. And I think you've hinted at the schedule dichotomy, right? The first 9 weeks of season, Michigan didn't play a soul. It was completely backloaded with Penn State, Ohio State, and Iowa. But you even start to assess those teams, and I think in my mind, if the top 4 or 5 teams in the country are down, these teams are probably down too? Like, what's the last big game Penn State's won? I mean, Drew Law.
They beat Utah in the Rose Bowl last year. It was massive for those of us heavily invested as a BTB best bet.
That is true, right? Struggled in Maryland. This was a down version of Ohio State, and Ohio State's tied with Michigan 17-17 late. It's the same Ohio State team that should have lost to Notre Dame. Iowa can't score. So I have a tougher time assessing the big boys this year because they're down compared to past versions. Michigan's struggling offense down the stretch. You hit on this. And you have to ask the question, is it a combination of playing 3 top 15 defenses while key guys like J.J. McCarthy and Roman Wilson and multiple offensive linemen battle through injuries? Or the Connor Stallion situation? Is that a bigger factor than we think and want to believe? 282 yards of offense on average for Michigan the final 4 games. Nick Saban is telling you there's an added advantage you have on your opponent, right? If you kind of know what to expect. That's why he went out and hired George Halo, a former Michigan coach leading up to this game. And
should have just hired Connor Stallions, honestly. That would have been a hell of a lot more entertaining.
Well, that was the joke online, right? People were photoshopping Connor Stallions onto the Alabama staff in their team directory, which is pretty funny. Is it 10% Stallions? Is it 90% injuries and opponent? What does that look like? I don't know, but it's probably a combination of everything. Put it in a pot. Figure out the percentages. I don't know. Matchup-wise, at some point in this game, Michigan is going to try to impose its will. This is the matchup I envisioned happening down the stretch, and it's why when we broke down those Alabama games, I mentioned their run defense and it potentially not looking as good as some of the surface level metrics, right? Bama's run defense on the surface, down to down, allowing 38% of runs to grade successful. Damn good. But the D-line has gotten pushed around at times, specifically inside, right? They're outside the top 95 in defensive line yards allowed. That's a touch more predictive of how you're going to defend the run moving forward, and that gap is large. At the same time, you said this at the top, and I know it's something we've mentioned throughout the course of this season in the big games that we broke Michigan down the stretch, right? And it's that Michigan hasn't gotten nearly as much push this season as they did last. You have a key offensive lineman in Zach Zinter who's out. Blake Corum and Donovan Edwards both had significant surgeries in the offseason. They just haven't looked themselves. They haven't looked as explosive. And you mentioned the gaudy touchdown numbers for Corum, but in terms of down-to-down efficiency, not as good. Michigan averaged 2.8 yards per rush before first contact last season. It's down to slightly above 2 this season. So Michigan's offensive line just hasn't been as good creating push. It's not elite. I would actually think in my mind, right, Sharon Moore is going to try to throw a curveball early, come out throwing because J.J. McCarthy is a little bit healthier. But you look at J.J. McCarthy, he threw Michigan out of last year's playoff game with costly mistakes. Is that going to be the fear in Sharon Moore's mind? You look at what the staff has asked J.J. to do in the biggest games this season, less than 150 passing yards against every ranked opponent. So they haven't looked to him to be a difference maker in these big games. Maybe that's the changeup. Something we've mentioned multiple times is Michigan's weapons. We've said all season the best is Roman Wilson. He's the one guy that occasionally can create separation. Alabama's secondary is far more talented than what Michigan is trotting out at receiver. They have not seen talent like this in the back end. Terrion Arnold, Kool-Aid McKinstry, and Caleb Downs have been elite in coverage this season. So if Michigan isn't able to dominate on the ground at the level they need to, or have early down success at the rate they've been accustomed to this season because the schedule's been so poor, and honestly that makes you comfortable as an offense, I start to wonder if the combination of receivers not creating separation, the offensive line being down a tick, which has kind of caused J.J. McCarthy, if you look, to be sacked a lot more in known situations. Michigan's outside the top 90 in passing down sack rate allowed. All of a sudden, if you're not in those positive situations, Alabama does have 2 dudes that are looking to get paid in Dallas Turner and Chris Braswell. They have combined for a 19% pressure rate on pass rush snaps. So that, to me, as the cat and mouse, is I would have thought Sharon Moore tries to open this up a little bit. We saw some tempo early against TCU last year in the college football playoff. We saw McCarthy throw it a little bit, get some play action going. I don't know if they trust him, even if he's healthier. So that becomes the ultimate key to this game is like, can you be physical enough and impose your will in the ground game that hasn't been doing that at the rate they were last season? And if you can't, I think the corners in the secondary are probably too good for Michigan, and then the pass rush becomes a problem because I know they've been dinged up. I know they've been beat up, but the tackles haven't been as good for Michigan as you'd hoped. As Brad broke down the other side of the ball, I came to this game thinking my side of the ball was the most important one. Then I started thinking about, as Brad broke that down, like, we might think differently. I might think the other side of the ball is almost more important. I'm intrigued to see how Michigan elects to defend Jalen Milroe based upon the blueprint that Kirby laid out. And that's kind of was my hesitation in not really assessing that Alabama win. It almost felt like Georgia went in there and said, like, hey, we think we're going to beat these guys. They're not overly talented. Kirby looked at the film and just went with this most vanilla ABC game plan known to mankind, and it bit him in the ass. But what they did with Jalen Milroe is effectively forced him to throw to the area of the fields that we've said, hey, he's not very good throwing at. Let's not have him throw there. But like 31% of his passes were forced to the intermediate part of the field against Georgia. And so my feeling is, yes, Jace McClellan should be back, right? So Bama's ground game should be a little bit better. But that offensive line is at a massive disadvantage against Michigan's D-line. So all of a sudden you keep Jalen Milroe in the pocket. And Brad mentioned the 4 sacks, 33% pressure to sack ratio. He's holding on to the ball forever because Georgia was taking away the deep shot. Now, I don't know if Michigan's secondary is good enough to do that, but they were taking away the deep shot. They were keeping him in the pocket, and they were making a pocket pass or throwing to the areas of the field that he simply can't do consistently. And I think you and I joked, Todd, if you pop on the All-22, looked like Alabama's receivers were, signaling in airplanes. They were just hand over the head wide open, just hey, throw the ball, Jalen, and he just couldn't.
You sit there and wait for the fair catch.
They were just streaking wide open underneath in the intermediate parts of the field, and he just couldn't get the ball to him. So, man, this game to me has so much variance, and I think that's why we're going to see a battle on this.
So two things for me that you guys have laid out, and I always sit here with pen and paper and try and take notes and either have some of my preconceived notions either confirmed or go, you know what, I didn't really think of that, as Payne and Brad lay out a case for Team A versus Team B on various sides of the ball that I think I want to watch. J.J. McCarthy and his ability to throw now being healthy, the lower body mechanics you'd hope would be better. He talked about in some of his quotes about not being able to mention the injury he was dealing with late in the season. I wonder if his legs become a bigger factor and Michigan decides, hey, look, we saw what Peyton Thorne and Auburn were able to do. JJ has some of those same skill sets if they're willing and comfortable with him taking a hit or two. The other player I want to watch for Michigan offensively is a guy that I think flashed last year for all of us. We know he dealt with some lower body injuries. I wonder if a month off and now having a full season under his belt, we'll see a little bit more big play potential from Donovan Edwards. He averaged 3.5 yards per carry. I know it takes a long time to return from some of those lower body injuries, but that's a guy that I expected a hell of a lot more out of in this Michigan offense this year, both as a runner and receiver, because anytime they put him out there last year against Ohio State or even against TCU in the game they lost, Edwards was the one player that you went, you know what? This guy has SEC caliber speed. He stands out amongst a bunch of slow plodding Big Ten skill position players. I just don't know if he's going to be healthy. If he is, that's suddenly a new element that Alabama will have to contend with as well.
You're going to need J.J. McCarthy's legs, not necessarily just designed in the zone read stuff, which would be a nice changeup or a curveball occasionally in short yardage. But if you are sitting in those third and mediums and you have Turner and Braswell getting up the field, right, you're going to want to take off and extend those drives with your legs. This is one thing I thought about, but it hasn't been prevalent this season, to your point, is we're talking about lackluster weapons potentially having issues creating separation, right, for Michigan, their receivers. Get them out in the pass game. That's something they truly implemented and wanted to kind of enforce in the offense last year. We're going to have Donovan Edwards getting out on wheel routes on linebackers. I haven't seen that juice from him this year. Maybe the 30 days off helps with that, but being reliant upon that and not having seen it really at any point this season is why I didn't really mention it, but it was in the back of my head. It's like, that guy's a matchup nightmare. You line him up in the slot, you get him on a wheel route and a linebacker, it can change Michigan's offense for sure.
One last thing, and I'll open it up to either of you before we close the book on this game and move into the nightcap and the Sugar Bowl between Washington and Texas. When we look at the betting market now, the books that I've spoken to, they fully expect that they're going to see Alabama money come in. They're not sure if that's going to be ultimately the professional side. I know it's a side that recreational bettors have leaned towards thus far. Do you guys think this number continues to trend towards pick'em, or do you think it's the perfect number now that's going to fluctuate 2.5 on the high end, lows of 1, and it's all going to depend on the individual sports book and the kind of clientele that they book to?
I think the latter. There certainly will be. I agree with Payne. There'll be a battle here. Recreational definitely trend towards the Alabama side. So if you want a cheap Michigan number betting and you're in town on Vegas, the stations of the world, the South Points of the world will probably have a cheap number if you want to bet Michigan. Some of the more professional books, and we already see that in some of the market already, are a little bit higher on the Michigan side. So I know guys that respect like Michigan here. I don't. I'm square as can be. I'm more on the Alabama side.
Should be.
I would echo Brad's sentiments. I don't really like talking bet percentages, but we do try to get a feel talking to a lot of guys behind the counter and where their action's coming in, and it seems to be Alabama in terms of the overall action, and I would think that continues when you're talking about a Monday game at 5 o'clock on New Year's, and going to be a lot of public betting this game. My understanding is at some point here, and there's been a few dabbles so far, and that's why Chris is highest in market on Michigan. But a very cheap Michigan money line has been the thought process, especially as you tick down on this total below the key of 45. That's been some things I've been hearing.
Should be one hell of a game. 2 blue bloods in an iconic setting in the Rose Bowl. Alabama taking on Michigan to get things started on New Year's Day in the college football playoff. Into the nightcap we go, gentlemen, where it's Texas and Washington renewing acquaintances that they met last year in the Alamo Bowl, a game that Washington won 27-20 as a similarly priced 3.5 to 4 point underdog. That's right where the market has this game set. 3.5 on the low end, upwards of 4. Total on the game, 63.5. And this kind of comes full circle for Steve Sarkisian, who got his first head coaching job in Seattle. And like we said last year, 27-20, it was Washington outgaining Texas 445 to 420 in that game. Michael Penix and Quinn Ewers both had tremendous days. Texas unable to really run the football consistently in that game. Washington brings back a trio of receivers that all finished with 45-plus receiving yards. When we look at some of the trends around these programs, Washington has been great under head coach Kalen DeBoer recently, producing straight up as an underdog with Michael Penix, beating Oregon in 2022 outright as a 12-point dog, doing that against Texas in the Alamo Bowl earlier this year. We'll call Oregon State +1. Doesn't really raise any red flags or eyebrows depending on when that closing number, but Washington put together its signature effort the last time we saw them in the Pac-12 championship, upsetting Oregon as a 10-point underdog. Texas will make its first college football playoff appearance, first Big 12 title for them since 2009 when they lost the BCS title game versus Alabama. 4-1 versus ranked teams this season. Their only loss came against number 12 Oklahoma on October 7th, a game where the Sooners try to use tempo and really tire out that Texas Longhorns defensive line. Steve Sarkisian and his staff, 15 games worth of experience in the college football playoff. Kyle Flood, Jeff Banks, Bo Davis, all had some time spent with Nick Saban in one capacity or another, the other appearance with Brad's beloved Notre Dame Fighting Irish there. We look at Washington, winners of 20 straight games. It's the longest active FBS streak and the second longest in school history. The 13 wins this year in a season, a school record, 4th undefeated regular season campaign in Washington history, the first since 1991. And when you look at the way this program has gone, Kalen DeBoer clearly has them trending in the right direction, to say the least. So, Brad, when we look at Texas on the offensive side, Quinn Ewers gives them a consummate veteran under center. He's announced his intentions to come back to Austin regardless of how this college football playoff run goes. We've seen them operate at the peak of their capabilities. Against Oklahoma State, he had a career-high 452 yards passing, got a lot of his offensive weapons involved, but from a ground game standpoint, Jonathan Brooks was lost to a torn ACL earlier this season. We're still not exactly sure the health and status of Xavier Worthy, although even with that ankle injury, expect him to be out there. Against the Huskies defense that doesn't get a lot of respect, and rightfully so, given some of the cricket numbers they've given up. But when you look at their bend but don't break mentality, they've done enough knowing that they can lean on a high-powered, explosive offense that if they give up 30 or less, they trust Michael Penix and company to be able to match their opponents. So when we look at Texas offensively, led by Quinn Ewers, against this Huskies defense, do we see a defined edge that one team will be able to take advantage of?
Yeah, I think certainly you got to give the edge to Texas's offense here. I mean, just basically speaking, I mean, if we're stack ranking the units, offense, defense among the 4 playoff teams, Washington's defense is going to rank dead last, 8th out of those units on offense and defense. I mean, basic counting stats aren't great. Yards per play, number 66. Yards per game, number 93. You mentioned it. They do a good job keeping down the scoring, relatively speaking. Some of the advanced metrics are a little bit better on that side of the ball for Washington, number 25 in defensive EPA. A question, that I have is outside of Braylon Trice, are they capable of getting pass rush on Quinn Ewers? Because, as good as Ewers has been, like any quarterback, you get some pressure in his face. I'm anxious to see how he does with a little bit of adversity. I don't know, because Braylon Trice, outside of him, there hasn't been a lot of guys for Washington that have been shown that capability. 19 sacks in all their games, 5 were in one game. So I have some concerns there. I also have some concerns when you look at what Sark likes to do offensively, create space for a multitude of weapons, whether it's Worthy or Mitchell at wide receiver, Sanders at tight end, a couple of the running backs even without Brooks. Can Washington tackle in space? Is a major question mark that I have. And, I mean, Washington missed 149 tackles this season, 8th most in the Power 5 level. So that would be a major concern I'd have in Washington, is their ability to one-on-one. You got to make that tackle in the open field. You mentioned it, Texas arguably coming off, when we talk about trend lines, offensively, trend lines as good as what they've been all year was in the last few games. Keep in mind, Ewers missed the BYU game, missed the Kansas State game, wasn't 100% for those a couple other starts where he came back. Certainly looked 100% in the Big 12 championship game. You mentioned it. 450 yards. The completion percentage was there, throwing it down the field. Now, since Brooks has went out, they've kind of gone to a running back by committee. 3 different players in 3 different games have led them in rushing. C.J. Baxter, Blue, and Keelan Robinson kind of gives them a different explosiveness type of player out of the backfield. I think a lot of it, the success of Texas's offense is going to come down to how healthy Worthy is. I'll take Sark at his word. Said Worthy was practicing last week, said he looked good. So I guess I got to believe Sark in that regard. Although, I mean, the guy was in a walking boot in the Big 12 championship game. So that still is a question for me. Another question for me would be, Texas offensive line. I thought it'd be a year away from being, hitting their ceiling. A very talented group, but relatively young when you look down the depth chart as far as, upperclassmen and underclassmen. It's a young group, but, man, when you start diving into their numbers, I mean, this team overachieved this year despite its inexperience. I mean, the pass blocking grade 4th at PFF, 3rd in the FBS if you look at their pressure rate allowed. So Washington, outside of Braylon Trice, not able to get pressure. Texas's offensive line not allowing pressure for the most part this season. I don't know. And when you talk about Sark putting players in space, Washington not being able to tackle in space very well, edge for me on Texas.
Makes a ton of sense. I mean, look, for anything that we want to say positive about the way Washington performed against Oregon, it's impossible to erase how that Huskies defense looked against 5-star athletes in the track meet they played at the Coliseum against USC just a few weeks prior in early November. Speaking of track meets, though, and what teams are capable of paying, the Washington offense, it's a team that possesses one of the most high-powered offenses in the country. They rank 4th in passing grade and 1st in receiving grade amongst Power 5 teams, according to PFF. When you look at Washington, they've been extremely effective off of play action, and that's where Michael Penix has been absolutely lethal. That clearly gets aided with a healthy Dylan Johnson out there, who was hobbled a little bit by a lower body injury late in the season, but still a guy that had over 1,100 rushing yards, 14 rushing touchdowns, was the most rushing touchdowns by a Washington player since 2017 when Myles Gaskin put 21 on the board. Meanwhile, we know about the Huskies' receiving room, and the rich get richer. I mean, Jalen McMillan missed extended stretches this season, but you wouldn't have known that watching his performance against Oregon, where his numbers dwarfed everybody else in that receiving room. You had another piece or two that they were trying to preserve red shirts on. It makes this Huskies offensive attack extremely explosive, and they're going to have to be good in the secondary because along the defensive front, Texas has two absolute behemoths that are game disruptors every opportunity, and Byron Murphy and Tavondre Sweat. But when we look at this Longhorns team, there is an area of weakness on this defense. If that defensive front can't generate pressure, I'm not sure this secondary has seen an arsenal of talent that is going to try and attack them in space, much like Quinn Ewers and companies will do on the other side against the Huskies D.
You know, we mentioned the health of these teams, right? Not just this game, but last game with 30 days off. And you have, you know, players dealing with minor injuries and dings and bumps and bruises. I think the layoff helps Washington on this side of the ball more just based on who we knew was playing injured in the Pac-12 championship, right? Michael Penix was playing through, we could say it now, a broken rib. Jalen McMillan, who you mentioned, has been battling issues all season. Dylan Johnson was playing with a significant ankle sprain. That key three being the healthiest they've been in a long time is huge, because I do think, to Brad's point, Texas is going to score here. I listened to Ryan Grubb's presser over the weekend. Didn't love all of the consistency talk about running the ball. Washington kind of discovered that part of its offense down the stretch with Dylan Johnson, and it was massive, right? You had some weather games that you needed him in. He was huge in the USC game, but you're simply not running on Texas, right? I mean,
sounds great in theory, but it ain't going to happen.
Yeah. There was a couple rare occasions, too, where like an individual player had some success, right? We had the quarterback runs from Dylan Gabriel, which changed the way that game unfolded, right? Harrison Wale had a decent game individually. You had Amani Bailey was somewhat efficient. Taj Brooks had some rushing yards on a blowout. But the Longhorns are top 5 in schedule-adjusted rushing success rate and EPA per rush allowed. You mentioned the big fellas up front. That's where it starts. The D-line was led by Tavondre Sweat. That's why top 5 in defensive line yards allowed. We have seen good run offenses try on Texas and then just abandon it, and many times it was kind of too late to flip the switch. I would think with 30 days to prepare, Washington has to flip the switch early or throw to set up the run in certain situations if they're trying to keep Texas somewhat honest. It's obvious, right? Washington has an advantage through the air. Texas is outside the top 75 in schedule-adjusted EPA per pass allowed. They give up the explosive. It's a very handsy and aggressive Longhorn secondary, so wouldn't be shocked if you see some penalties. It's really important Washington receivers are ready to play a little bit more physical than usual. Ryan Grubb mentioned that in his presser as well about receivers having good secondary releases. But you start to look at the offenses Texas has played this season. They faced 6 backup quarterbacks. On average, Texas has played the 62nd most efficient passing offenses, but you really start to parse through some of those games individually and see when they were played. Texas gets credit for facing a top 15 Kansas passing offense. Kansas played with its backup, Jason Bean, and Bean found out he was starting 40 minutes before kickoff.
I can't stand here for the Jason Bean slander, not after he throws 6 touchdown passes in his finest college football game, Payne.
Against UNLV.
How dare you? How dare you?
Alabama ended the season a top 10 passing offense. That was not the Jalen Milroe in the Tide passing attack with a brand new OC that Texas saw in week 2, right, versus how they ended the season. Just vastly different. So if Washington can protect up the middle and prevent Sweat and Sorrell from wrecking this game by getting direct pressure on Michael Penix and moving him off his spot, which is when he's a little bit different, when he's moved off his spot, I think the Huskies are going to have success throwing the ball here. Nate Kalepo, Washington's left guard, who to me is probably the weak link along the line, has to play to a level he did against both Oregon and Utah. And you look at Kalepo, I mean, he has 2 best pass blocking games of the season against those 2 best defenses on the schedule. If Washington gets that version of Kalepo, I think it goes a long ways here. I want to kind of pitch this back to you guys because these 2 teams played each other in the Alamo Bowl. We both know the types of defenses they run. We know that there's been some connectivity with coaches along the way. They play the 4-2-5. It's built to stop passing attacks. Do we take anything or glean anything from that Alamo Bowl game? I mean, Quinn Ewers was relatively efficient, right? Went 31 for 47, 369 yards. The points weren't necessarily there.
Look, I think the one thing that I saw, and then Brad, I'll let you jump in, was that Washington came out early and I think took Texas a little bit by surprise. They were able to hit a couple of big plays, and then you could see Texas's physicality start to wear them down a little bit, but they weren't able to consistently sustain those drives and turn them all into points. And I don't want to say it was a harbinger for things to come for Texas this year, but that's been the biggest question for Texas. They move the ball as effectively as any team when it comes to between the 20s. It's what do they do when they get into the red zone? What do they do when they get into goal-to-go situations? This is the kind of game where I think if you're Washington defensively, you're more than happy. If Texas racks up 400 or 500 yards and every drive ends in a field goal, that has to be a win. And you saw a little bit of those principles employed against Oregon, that all it takes is a turnover here, a turnover there for a team that has 16 picks on the season. And I think that plays into Washington's wheelhouse.
I also think, going back to it, Texas was hit much harder as far as the opt-outs. Bijan Robinson, Roschon Johnson, a bunch of other guys. So I just remember where I was betting. I took a pretty strong position on Washington pre-flop there. So I don't take much from that, because I also think that Texas still had some culture issues in that locker room, even in the second year under Sark. They don't have that problem this year.
Makes sense. I do wonder, to your point, Todd, is once Brooks went down, is there that guy where, hey, they're able to move it between the 20s? Do you have that guy? And right, like I just look at something basic, and there's a ton of variance, right? Because football is a small sample size sport. But I think, Todd, you laid it out perfectly. We got a very fortunate with our Texas Baylor under because of what Texas was able to do defensively when Baylor got inside their green zone. But on both sides of the ball, points per opportunity, Texas is outside the top 50 offensively and defensively. So when opponents get into the Texas 40, they're scoring some points. When Texas gets into the 40, they're struggling to score some points relative to their efficiency profile.
Look, I mean, I think for Washington, and Payne, you've talked about this at great lengths, not just in college football, but the NFL, where play action, even if you can't run the ball effectively, can be an extremely valuable tool. And I think you'll know pretty early on for Washington, if Texas commits linebackers or even has to move a safety into the box because they're worried about Dylan Johnson, I haven't seen anything from this Texas secondary that leads me to believe that they can cover these Washington receivers in space if they're able to get some of that clean release. If Texas doesn't fear the run and they're able to get penetration with their front four against the Joe Moore Award winners, this game's over before it starts because it allows you to do more complex things in the back. And when you look at Michael Penix, the numbers haven't been nearly as good when he operates as a true drop-back passer compared to when he's utilizing components of play action.
Makes a world of sense. We're starting to see the market move a little bit here. Iowa, Tennessee there. Interesting.
Yeah, didn't know that game was going to move as early as it had. Yeah. Let's put it that way. But no, I think these two semifinal games are going to be extremely fascinating. We're in for a real treat to see these teams in a contrast in styles. And when you look at all four of them, I mean, it's been rare in the college football playoff era that we can come into a game with four teams remaining and none of these teams winning the national championship would truly shock me, because I see a path for all four of them, unlike what we've seen in the past where you go, all right, there's one or two teams that can win it. We're on a crash course to see Georgia play Alabama, and even if a TCU or Michigan gets through, you don't think that they have a legitimate shot to take home the national title. This year, I think all four of them, if things break the right way, can be able to go out there and have their name etched in college football immortality. So should be great to try and see, but I'll leave the final word to you boys. So if anybody has anything else they'd like to add to either of these games, now is your chance, or forever hold your peace before we reconvene to discuss the college football national championship about a week from now.
I will say this: while I'm expecting a Proposers Joe's battle in the market on Alabama, Michigan, my sense is Washington is going to get the money here. I think this game much more likely to close below 4, where we stand at most books now, than above 4. I'll put it that way.
Agreed.
All right. Succinct and short for a long-winded breakdown of the two games. Want to remind all of you, our loyal Bet the Board listeners, you can follow Brad on social media at BradPower7. You can follow Payne there as well at Payne Insider, and you can follow me at Todd Fuhrman. All right, my friend, it's often bittersweet when we get to this portion of the program because this theoretically could be the last college football best bet of the entire season. I know last year we gave everybody a rocking chair winner. They were able to light up their victory cigar after 2 drives with Georgia in the national championship. We'll have to see if we can replicate that feat, but what have we identified of the remaining bowl games that we think gives us the best opportunity to make a few shekels?
Bittersweet, huh? I can't wait to get this over with.
I know. Dad, you know what? Let's peel back the curtain a little bit. You told me before we recorded how the season has flown by and how much you're going to miss talking college football with Brad and I. So, it's okay. You can be a tough guy up front, but we know the real softer, gentler, sentimental
No. I think you misinterpreted there.
Oh, I do that from time to time.
Let me be your translator. I just meant in terms of finding a game that has the edge as large as Georgia did last season.
That's not going to happen.
Don't see it.
That's not going to happen.
We talked at the top here about this specific bowl season until they change the calendar. There's going to be a lot more chaos. And literally as we're sitting here trying to find a best bet, you have 7 games get absolutely buried through key numbers. So it's kind of limited some options for us.
And multiple were considered as of last night. So they get nicked immediately on the cutting room floor.
Yeah, so I know there's a little discrepancy in opinions here, excuse me. I can see the path. I know where the information's going to eventually come in, so we're kind of playing that information. What it does forward-facing in the market in terms of movement, I don't know. But I think we go a little contrarian here. Fire up rotation number 280, Michigan, money line. Excuse me, I'm going to cough. Boy, that mute button came in handy there. So I think let's go with the Michigan money line here. There's minus 115 out there, minus $1.18, minus 120 everywhere. Let's try to get the best number here we can on the Michigan money line. Typically, not as needing to go money line, but again, 45, the key number there for totals. We're getting hit under that, so we're now in that 44.5 territory where it makes a little bit more sense, where points are at a premium, potentially. And we'll exercise the money line option on a cheap buy there at minus 115. When you think about the sharpest shops like a Chris shading Michigan to 2.5, and you can go and get minus 115 on the money line, just inherently that is a better buy. Before you even start to equate that total in there. But we did discuss this game, broke it down, deep dive style. It will be time-stamped above. But I think if Michigan can get their ground game going with a little bit healthier of an offensive line, that's a positive. Listen, if J.J. McCarthy's tasked with throwing on 3rd and medium, 3rd and long here, it's probably not going to go
First round NFL draft pick J.J. McCarthy, Payne.
Yeah.
We're going to see it on full display. No idea what NFL team would draft him, but that's neither here nor there.
It's interesting because, I started to have a little bit of a different opinion on which side of the ball was stronger as Brad was breaking it down for us, and I almost started to come around with I do think potentially the largest edge in this game is Michigan's defensive line against that Alabama front, which I do know played a little bit better down the stretch. Brad referenced Caden Proctor, a true freshman starting that's a 5-star status, could look vastly different in 15 practices in 30 days than from what we saw him back in week 5. But I do believe you just saw the Kirby Smart game plan, and I know it didn't win, but taking away the deep, putting the spy on Milroe, and then forcing Milroe to be that thrower in the intermediate area where he had to attempt 31% of his passes against Georgia was not efficient at all. So I think when you're building out that game plan, there's some possibilities here where you can force Milroe to throw to certain areas where he's not as proficient, and I think ultimately that'll be That'll be the difference here. So Michigan on the cheap by a money line makes a world of sense here.
Let's do it. Michigan Wolverines, maize and blue. Streaks are made to be broken. We know what the narrative will be leading up to this game. Nick Saban, extra time to prepare. Jim Harbaugh hasn't been able to get the job done. This may be Harbaugh's last gasp. Who knows, Payne? We could be talking about him as the next head coach of the Chicago Bears or somewhere else in the National Football League if he's able to bring the hardware back to Ann Arbor this particular playoff run. But should be fun, no doubt about it.
Didn't they extend him? You're saying go out on a high note anyways.
The extension is on the table, is my understanding from what's been
has
circulated.
Not been signed yet.
So I don't know if pen has gone to paper just yet for the ridiculous amount of money that's there.
There's going to be a lot of jobs, I would think, coming open here that'll be quite interesting. And I got to tell you, the way the college football calendar is, I mean, it's kind of hectic being a college football coach. I will say that. Now, I think your lifeline is probably longer in college if you're semi-decent at your job compared to the NFL.
Yeah, if you pick the right program, you can go 8-4 every year. You can have the worst offense in the country, and you get the longest tenure in the Big Ten. Just ask Kirk Ferentz.
What's the deal with the status of Kentucky's coach there, Stoops? He seems to be loving life. Making bank.
Guy's got nothing to be angry about. Living the life he is in Lexington. We know he was attached to some other gigs and all of that.
Well, they gave him the A&M job.
Yeah, that whole situation was a little bit bizarre, and it was pushback. It almost reminded me of Greg Schiano to Tennessee. That's
exactly what it was.
They put it out there. They try and gauge the temperature of the fan base. The fan base pushes back, and they go, no, we haven't officially extended him the offer. And you're quickly scrambling to put the papers in the shredder, much like Jordan Belfort running his investment firm.
All right, that was good. We're going to send you out on a high note. Let's close this thing up.
I'm out. Yeah, well, I was going to quote Costanza, but there's no reason. No reason to quote Costanza. Thanks again to Brad Powers for stepping in. He's been outstanding all college football season long. I know he did a great job breaking down 29 bowl games for all of our listeners. To try and make sure that they could go into those games with an edge. Want to wish all of the Bet the Board listeners out there the happiest and healthiest of New Year's. Hopefully the holiday season has treated them well. We'll be back with you on Thursday for a little NFL week 17. I can't even keep track. I think it's week 17. Don't even know anymore. And the national championship game will most likely be tied into an NFL podcast, but more details on that forthcoming, as since we make the rules around here, we can make those decisions on the fly. So best of luck with all of your remaining bowl positions, and most importantly, come January 1st, 2024, with a Michigan Wolverines moneyline ticket in hand, we'll see you at the window.
We hope you enjoyed listening to this episode of Bet the Board. Make sure you follow Todd and Payne on X. Todd is at Todd Fuhrman. That's TODDFUHRMAN. And Payne is at Payne Insider. That's PAYNEINSIDER. Don't forget, our weekly newsletter comes with an additional best bet. Have that delivered to your inbox by clicking the link atop the podcast show notes. And most importantly, subscribe and download Bet the Board. We're on Apple, Spotify, Amazon Wondery, YouTube, Google Podcasts, and all your other major platforms.